Some secrets are buried so deep that even those who lived them convince themselves they never happened. Marcus Wellington had spent 15 years telling himself that the events of October 13, 2018 were nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination. After all, how could a simple palace guard witness something that would shake the very foundation of the Valdonian royal family? But when Princess Charlotte's engagement announcement flashed across his television screen last Tuesday, the memories came flooding back like a dam bursting open. The trembling in his hands wasn't from age or nerves. It was from the weight of a truth so dangerous that speaking it could cost him everything, including his life. Marcus Wellington never imagined that standing perfectly still for hours would become the most dangerous skill of his life. For 12 years, he had served as a member of the Royal Guard at Blackstone Palace, the ancestral home of the Valdonian royal family. His job was simple: blend into the background, see nothing worth remembering, and protect the royal family with his life if necessary. He had mastered the art of becoming invisible, a human statue draped in ceremonial uniform, present but unnoticed. The morning of October 13, 2018, began like any other autumn day in the capital city of Valdris. Marcus arrived at the palace gates at precisely 5:30 a.m., his polished boots clicking against the ancient cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. The morning mist clung to the palace walls like ghostly fingers, and the air carried the scent of wet leaves and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the palace kitchens. As he passed through the security checkpoint, Marcus exchanged brief nods with his colleagues. Thomas Brennan, a fellow guard who had served even longer than Marcus, gave him a knowing look. They had both learned that in this place, the less you seemed to notice, the longer you survived. The palace was filled with whispers, glances, and conversations that stopped abruptly when uniformed personnel entered a room. Marcus's assignment that day was the East Wing corridor, specifically the stretch between Princess Charlotte's private chambers and the Queen's morning room. Princess Charlotte, at 22, had become the darling of the Valdonian people. Her charity work, her grace at public events, and her genuine warmth had made her more popular than even her mother, Queen Isabella. The newspapers couldn't get enough of her, and speculation about her future marriage had become a national obsession. The princess was known to be an early riser, often taking her morning tea in the sunroom before her official duties began. Marcus had observed this routine countless times, noting how she moved with purpose even in her private moments. Unlike some royals who seemed to float through life, Princess Charlotte carried herself with determination that reminded him of a soldier preparing for battle. That morning, however, something felt different. The usual bustle of palace staff seemed more subdued, and Marcus noticed several unfamiliar faces among the cleaning crew. When he mentioned this to Sergeant Davies during the brief morning meeting, he was told simply to focus on your own duties and ask no questions. By 8 a.m., Marcus had taken his position outside the princess's chambers. The corridor was lined with portraits of previous Valdonian rulers, their painted eyes seeming to watch every movement. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that danced as clouds passed overhead. Marcus had stood in this exact spot hundreds of times, but today the familiar surroundings felt charged with an inexplicable tension. Princess Charlotte emerged from her chambers at 8:15 a.m., earlier than usual. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her long auburn hair was pulled back in a casual style that suggested she wasn't expecting any formal meetings. What struck Marcus immediately was her expression. There was something troubled in her usually bright demeanor, a shadow that hadn't been there the previous day. "Good morning, Marcus," she said softly as she passed. She had always made it a point to acknowledge the guards by name, a kindness that wasn't common among royalty. But today, her voice carried a weight that made him want to ask if she was all right. Of course, protocol forbade such familiarity. "Good morning, Your Highness," he replied with a slight bow, watching as she made her way toward the Queen's morning room. 20 minutes later, raised voices echoed from behind the heavy oak doors. Marcus had heard royal family discussions before. They were, after all, human beings with human disagreements. But this was different. The anger in Queen Isabella's voice was unmistakable, and he could hear Princess Charlotte's responses, though he couldn't make out the specific words. Marcus fought the urge to step closer to the door. His training had been clear. Overhearing private conversations was an offense that could result in immediate dismissal and possible criminal charges. The royal family's privacy was sacred, protected not just by law but by centuries of tradition. Yet something about the intensity of the argument made his instincts scream that this was more than a typical family disagreement. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with periods of silence broken by renewed heated exchanges. At one point, Marcus heard what sounded like something heavy being thrown against a wall. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio, but then he heard Princess Charlotte's voice, clearer now and obviously closer to the door. "I won't do it, Mother. Not for the family, not for the crown, not for anyone." Queen Isabella's response was lower, more controlled, but Marcus could hear the steel in her voice. "You will do as you're told, Charlotte. The arrangements have been made, and there is no other choice." "There's always a choice," the princess replied, her voice breaking slightly. "What you're asking me to do, it's not right. It's not legal. People will be hurt." Marcus felt his blood run cold. In 12 years of service, he had never heard Princess Charlotte speak with such anguish or determination. Whatever was being discussed went far beyond typical royal duties or marriage arrangements. The argument ended abruptly with the sound of a door slamming. Moments later, Princess Charlotte emerged from the morning room, her face flushed and her eyes bright with unshed tears. She walked past Marcus without acknowledgement, moving quickly toward the main staircase that led to the palace's central courtyard. Marcus remained at his post, his mind racing with questions he couldn't ask and concerns he couldn't voice. Protocol demanded that he report any unusual incidents, but what could he say? That the princess and queen had argued? Royal families argued all the time. That Princess Charlotte seemed upset? She was young and under tremendous pressure. That he had overheard fragments of a conversation that suggested something improper? He had no context and no proof. 10 minutes later, Queen Isabella emerged from the morning room. Marcus had seen the queen hundreds of times, had observed her during state functions, private moments, and everything in between. He had never seen her look as she did in that moment. Not angry, not upset, but coldly determined in a way that made his skin crawl. "Marcus?" she said, approaching him directly. This was unusual. The queen rarely acknowledged guards individually unless there was a specific reason. "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied, snapping to attention. "I trust you understand the importance of discretion in your duties," she said, her blue eyes meeting his directly. "The royal family's private discussions must remain absolutely private. I'm sure you understand." "Of course, Your Majesty. Complete discretion is part of my oath." The queen studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating whether he truly understood the weight of his words. "Good. I'm glad we understand each other." As she walked away, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air drifting through the corridor windows. The queen's words had been polite and appropriate, but the message underneath was unmistakable. Forget what you heard, or face the consequences. The rest of Marcus's shift passed without incident, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something significant. Princess Charlotte didn't return to her chambers until late afternoon, and when she did, she was accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits whom Marcus didn't recognize. They weren't royal officials. He knew all of them by sight. These men had the bearing of businessmen or perhaps lawyers, and they carried briefcases that suggested important documents. The meeting in Princess Charlotte's chambers lasted 2 hours. When the men finally left, Marcus noticed that one of them made a phone call immediately upon exiting the palace. The conversation was brief, but Marcus caught a few words. "She's agreed, and everything is in place." That evening, as Marcus prepared to end his shift, he was approached by Captain Morrison, the head of palace security. Morrison was a stern man who had served the royal family for over 20 years, and his approval was essential for any guard's career advancement. "Wellington, I need to speak with you privately," Morrison said, gesturing toward a small office near the guard's quarters. Marcus followed, his stomach knotting with apprehension. Had someone reported that he had overheard the argument? Was he about to be dismissed for failing to properly ignore a private conversation? "Sit down," Morrison said, closing the door behind them. "I understand you were posted outside the Queen's morning room today during a family discussion." "Yes, sir. Standard corridor duty." "And I trust everything remained appropriately private?" Marcus chose his words carefully. I performed my duties exactly as trained, sir. I saw nothing that required action and heard nothing that was meant for my ears. Morrison nodded approvingly. Good. That's exactly what I expected to hear. He paused, leaning back in his chair. Marcus, you've been an exemplary guard for 12 years. Your record is spotless, your dedication unquestioned. That's why I'm going to share something with you that I wouldn't tell most guards. Marcus waited, unsure whether he wanted to hear what was coming next. The royal family is facing some challenges that require absolute discretion from all palace personnel. Princess Charlotte in particular is dealing with pressures that most people couldn't understand. Sometimes these pressures result in emotional discussions that might sound concerning to someone who doesn't have the full picture. I understand, sir. I'm sure you do. But I want you to know that everything happening within these walls is being handled appropriately by people far more qualified than either of us. Your job is to stand guard, not to interpret or remember private conversations. Can I count on you for that? Absolutely, sir. Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Excellent. I knew I could count on your professionalism. He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Oh, and Marcus? I'm recommending you for a commendation for your excellent service. Keep up the good work. As Marcus walked home that evening through the winding streets of Old Valdres, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had just been warned rather than complimented. The commendation felt less like recognition and more like a golden leash, a reminder of what he could lose if he spoke out of turn. His small apartment overlooked the harbor, and as he stood at his window watching fishing boats return with the day's catch, Marcus replayed the events over and over in his mind. Princess Charlotte's words echoed. What you're asking me to do, it's not right. It's not legal. People will be hurt. What could the royal family be planning that would hurt people? What arrangements had been made without Princess Charlotte's initial consent? And why had everyone from the Queen to Captain Morrison felt the need to ensure his silence about what he might have overheard? Marcus poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down at his small kitchen table. On it lay the evening newspaper, and Princess Charlotte's face smiled up at him from the front page. The headline read, Princess Charlotte launches new children's charity initiative. In the photo, she looked radiant and happy, the perfect image of a beloved royal doing good works. But Marcus had seen her face that morning, had heard the anguish in her voice. The woman in the newspaper photo and the woman who had emerged from the Queen's morning room seemed like two completely different people. As the night grew darker and the harbor lights began to twinkle like stars, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He would follow his orders, perform his duties, and keep his mouth shut. Whatever was happening within the palace walls was beyond his understanding and above his pay grade. He was just a guard, after all. But, deep down, Marcus Wellington knew that October 13th, 2018, had been the day his innocence about the royal family he served had died forever. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Princess Charlotte's troubles were just beginning, and that he had witnessed the opening act of a drama that would ultimately destroy everything he thought he knew about duty, loyalty, and truth. This is the book. It's about history. 3 weeks passed before Marcus saw Princess Charlotte again, and when he did, she was barely recognizable as the vibrant young woman who had once greeted him by name each morning. The transformation was so stark that it took him a moment to realize who was walking down the corridor toward him. Her auburn hair, once lustrous and carefully styled, now hung limp around her shoulders. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes seemed to hang loosely on her frame, as if she had lost weight rapidly. Most disturbing of all was her expression. The warm intelligence that had always characterized her had been replaced by a blank, almost vacant stare. Marcus was stationed at his usual post outside the East Wing when she appeared, flanked by 2 women he didn't recognize. They weren't palace staff. Their clothing was too formal, too clinical. One carried a leather portfolio, the other a small medical bag. They walked on either side of Princess Charlotte like escorts, their eyes constantly scanning the corridor, as if watching for potential problems. "Good morning, Your Highness," Marcus said automatically, offering his customary bow. Princess Charlotte stopped walking and turned to look at him. For a moment her eyes seemed to focus, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of recognition. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but one of the women quickly stepped forward. "The princess isn't feeling well today," the woman said firmly. "She needs to rest." "I know you," Princess Charlotte said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're Marcus. You were there when?" She trailed off, her expression becoming confused and distant. "Come along, Your Highness," the other woman said, taking Princess Charlotte gently but firmly by the arm. "Dr. Hartwell is waiting for you." As they led her away, Princess Charlotte looked back over her shoulder at Marcus. In that brief glance, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Not confusion or illness, but fear. Raw, desperate fear. That afternoon, Marcus sought out his friend Thomas Brennan during their break. Thomas had been working the South Wing, closer to the royal family's private medical facilities, and Marcus hoped he might have some insight into what was happening to Princess Charlotte. They met in the palace gardens, away from the corridors where conversations could be overheard. The autumn air was crisp, and the smell of burning leaves drifted from the groundskeeper's work in the far corners of the estate. "Tom, have you noticed anything unusual about Princess Charlotte lately?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Thomas glanced around nervously before answering. "Why do you ask?" "She seems different. Unwell." "Marcus," Thomas said quietly, "you know we're not supposed to discuss the royal family's personal matters. I'm not asking for gossip. I'm concerned. She looks seriously ill today." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he spoke. "There have been doctors coming and going for the past 2 weeks, not the usual palace physician specialists from outside. And I've seen medical equipment being brought in." "Serious equipment? What kind of equipment?" "I don't know exactly, but it looked like the kind of things you'd see in a hospital psychiatric ward. Restraint devices, monitoring equipment, things like that." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Psychiatric ward? What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Thomas said quickly. "I'm just telling you what I've seen. But Marcus, there's something else. My cousin works in the palace communications office, and she says there have been meetings with lawyers, lots of them, and something about competency hearings." The implications of Thomas's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. A competency hearing would be used to declare someone mentally unfit to make their own decisions. If Princess Charlotte were declared incompetent, control of her affairs, including any decisions about marriage, public duties, or legal matters, would pass to her family. "Tom, what if she's not actually ill? What if someone is making her ill?" Thomas grabbed Marcus's arm. "Don't even think thoughts like that, let alone say them out loud. Do you understand what you're suggesting?" Marcus pulled away. "I'm suggesting that 3 weeks ago, Princess Charlotte was perfectly healthy and arguing with her mother about something she said wasn't legal. Now she can barely form complete sentences and is surrounded by doctors and lawyers discussing competency. Don't you find that suspicious?" "What I find is that you're talking about things that could get us both fired or worse," Thomas hissed. "Whatever is happening is none of our business. Our job is to guard the doors, not to play detective." But Marcus couldn't let it go. That evening, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going straight home after his shift, he waited in the palace parking area until he saw the 2 women who had been with Princess Charlotte that morning. He followed them at a distance as they left the palace grounds. The women drove to a medical facility on the outskirts of Valdres, a private clinic that Marcus recognized as one of the most exclusive and expensive in the country. He parked across the street and watched as they entered the building through a side entrance, using what appeared to be employee access cards. Unable to follow them inside, Marcus circled the building and noted several things that struck him as odd. First, the windows on the 3rd floor, which appeared to be patient rooms, were covered with heavy screens that looked more like security measures than privacy curtains. Second, the parking area had several unmarked vans that looked more like surveillance vehicles than medical transport. As he was preparing to leave, Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Through an uncovered window on the ground floor, he caught a glimpse of a man in a white coat speaking animatedly into a phone. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the man's lips well enough to make out a few key phrases. "The treatment is progressing, and she'll be completely compliant within days." Marcus drove home with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The word compliant echoed in his mind. Medical treatments were supposed to make people better, not compliant. The distinction was crucial and terrifying. Over the next few days, Marcus began to notice other troubling details that he had previously overlooked. Palace staff who had worked closely with Princess Charlotte were being reassigned to different duties. Her personal secretary, a woman named Helen who had served the princess for over 5 years, was suddenly transferred to work in the archives. Her longtime bodyguard was sent on extended leave for family reasons. Most disturbing of all, Marcus noticed that all of Princess Charlotte's scheduled public appearances had been quietly cancelled. The official explanation was that she was suffering from exhaustion and needed rest, but Marcus had seen exhausted royals before. They didn't require psychiatric specialists and competency hearings. On November 2nd, exactly 3 weeks after his conversation with Thomas, Marcus witnessed something that convinced him beyond any doubt that Princess Charlotte was in serious danger. He was working the night shift, a rotation that normally involved monitoring the palace's quieter corridors while the royal family slept. Around 2 a.m., he heard voices coming from the direction of Princess Charlotte's chambers. This wasn't unusual. Medical staff often checked on patients during the night, but something about the tone of the conversation caught his attention. Moving carefully down the corridor, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe without being seen. Through a partially open door, he could see Princess Charlotte sitting on the edge of her bed while a man in a white coat prepared a syringe. The same 2 women who had become her constant companions stood nearby. "Please," Princess Charlotte was saying, her voice weak but desperate. "I don't want any more injections. They make me feel so strange. I can't think clearly." "This will help you sleep, Your Highness," the doctor replied, his tone professional but cold. "You need your rest." "But I don't want to sleep. I want to call my father. I want to speak to someone outside of here. Please, just let me make one phone call." One of the women stepped forward. "Your Highness, we've discussed this. Your father is aware of your treatment, and he agrees that it's best for you to focus on getting well. Outside contact would only agitate you further." Marcus watched as they held Princess Charlotte's arm while the doctor administered the injection. Within minutes, her protests became weaker, her words slurred, and she lay back on the bed with a vacant expression. "How much longer will this take?" one of the women asked the doctor. "Another week, maybe 2. We're making excellent progress. Her resistance to suggestion is almost completely broken down. Soon she'll agree to whatever arrangements have been made." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. Whatever was being done to Princess Charlotte wasn't medical treatment, it was systematic psychological manipulation, designed to break down her ability to resist. And it was working. As the medical team prepared to leave, Marcus quickly retreated to his post. His mind was racing with the implications of what he had witnessed. Princess Charlotte wasn't ill. She was being drugged and psychologically manipulated to make her compliant with some arrangement she had previously refused. But what arrangement? And what could Marcus, a simple palace guard, possibly do to help her? The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He requested a meeting with Captain Morrison, ostensibly to discuss a security concern he had observed. In reality, he was hoping to find someone within the palace hierarchy who might be unaware of what was happening to Princess Charlotte. Morrison received him in his office with the same professional courtesy as always, but Marcus noticed something different in the captain's demeanor, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "What can I do for you, Wellington?" "Sir, I've observed some unusual activity around Princess Charlotte's chambers during night shifts. Medical personnel coming and going at odd hours, equipment being brought in and out. I wanted to make sure these visits were authorized and that there weren't any security protocols I should be aware of." Morrison studied Marcus carefully for several long moments before responding. "The princess is receiving medical treatment for a serious condition. The medical team has full authorization to access her chambers as needed. Your job is to ensure that unauthorized personnel don't interfere with her treatment." "Of course, sir. I just wanted to make sure I understood the parameters of my duties." "Your duties are exactly the same as they've always been, Wellington. Stand your post, protect the royal family, and maintain absolute discretion about anything you might observe." Morrison's tone grew harder. "I hope I've made myself clear." "Perfectly clear, sir." As Marcus left Morrison's office, he realized with growing horror that the captain was not only aware of what was happening to Princess Charlotte, he was actively participating in it. The entire palace hierarchy, from the queen down to the security staff, was complicit in whatever was being done to her. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment staring at his phone. He had written down the number for the Valdonian National Police, and several times he had started to dial, but each time he stopped, paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was considering. Who would believe him? A palace guard accusing the queen of orchestrating some kind of conspiracy against her own daughter? Even if someone took his allegations seriously, what proof did he have? He had overheard conversations, observed suspicious behavior, and witnessed medical treatments that seemed inappropriate. But he had no documents, no recordings, no evidence that would stand up in court. Moreover, Marcus understood the full implications of speaking out. He wouldn't just lose his job, he would be destroyed. The royal family had resources and influence that could ensure he never worked again, that his reputation was ruined, that his very freedom was threatened. They had already demonstrated their ability to make people disappear from Princess Charlotte's life without explanation. As November stretched into December, Marcus watched helplessly as Princess Charlotte deteriorated further. Her few public appearances were brief and heavily managed, with palace officials explaining that she was still recovering from her illness. In photographs, she looked pale and distant, her smile forced, and her eyes empty. The treatment was working exactly as the doctor had predicted. Princess Charlotte was becoming compliant, agreeable, and apparently incapable of independent thought. The vibrant young woman who had once argued passionately with her mother about matters of right and wrong was being systematically erased. On December 15th, the palace announced that Princess Charlotte had become engaged to Duke Edmund of Westmarch, a man 30 years her senior whom she had met only twice before her illness began. The official statement described it as a love match, but Marcus remembered the mysterious men in suits who had visited Princess Charlotte in October and the overheard phone call about everything being in place. The Duke of Westmarch was known to be enormously wealthy but politically problematic. His business dealings included partnerships with several foreign governments that Valdonia officially opposed, and there had been persistent rumors about his involvement in arms trafficking. A marriage to Princess Charlotte would legitimize him and provide him with diplomatic immunity that he desperately needed. Marcus finally understood the arrangement that Princess Charlotte had initially refused. She was being married off to provide political cover for a man whose activities were questionable at best. Her refusal had led to her systematic psychological destruction, turning her into a compliant shell who would agree to whatever was demanded of her. The engagement announcement was met with public celebration, but Marcus noticed that several longtime palace staff members quietly requested transfers or resigned altogether. They couldn't speak out about what they had witnessed, but they could remove themselves from participating in it further. As Christmas approached, Marcus made a final attempt to reach Princess Charlotte. During a moment when her handlers were distracted, he approached her in a corridor and spoke quietly. "Your Highness, if you need help, if you want to contact someone outside the palace, I can help you." Princess Charlotte looked at him with no recognition whatsoever. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" she asked politely, her voice pleasant but completely empty of the warmth he remembered. In that moment, Marcus understood that Princess Charlotte, the real Princess Charlotte who had once known his name and argued about right and wrong, was gone. What remained was a carefully constructed facade designed to serve the royal family's purposes. That night, Marcus Wellington made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would keep silent, perform his duties, and try to forget what he had witnessed. The truth was too dangerous, the consequences too severe, and the victim too thoroughly destroyed for justice to matter anymore. But as he lay in bed that night, Marcus knew that his silence made him complicit in Princess Charlotte's destruction, and that knowledge would eat away at his soul for the next 5 years, until the announcement of her engagement to another man would bring all the buried memories flooding back, demanding to be acknowledged at last. The wedding of Princess Charlotte to Duke Edmund of Westmarch took place on a cold February morning in 2019. 4 months after the engagement announcement. Marcus was assigned to ceremonial duty at the cathedral, standing at attention while the nation celebrated what they believed was a fairy tale romance. From his position near the altar, Marcus had a perfect view of the bride as she walked down the aisle. Princess Charlotte moved like a sleepwalker, her steps precise and mechanical. Her wedding dress was magnificent, a creation of silk and lace that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But it seemed to hang on her like a costume on an actress playing a role she didn't understand. The most chilling moment came during the vows. When asked if she took Duke Edmund as her husband, Princess Charlotte paused for so long that murmurs began to ripple through the cathedral. Her eyes seemed to search the crowd, as if looking for someone who might save her. Then, just as the silence was becoming uncomfortable, she smiled that empty, practiced smile and spoke the words that sealed her fate. "I do." Marcus noticed that Queen Isabella's shoulders relaxed visibly at that moment, as if she had been holding her breath. The Duke, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and hands that seemed too large for his body, gripped Princess Charlotte's hand tightly during the ceremony, never letting go even when protocol didn't require physical contact. After the ceremony, Marcus was assigned to security detail at the wedding reception. The celebration was lavish beyond imagination, with foreign dignitaries, business leaders, and European royalty filling the palace ballroom. But Marcus found himself watching Princess Charlotte throughout the evening, documenting in his memory the way she moved through the crowd like a ghost. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and performed every duty of a new bride with mechanical perfection. But Marcus, who had known the real Charlotte, could see that this was a masterful performance by someone who had been trained to behave exactly as required. The spontaneous laughter, the genuine curiosity about others, the passionate engagement with causes she cared about, all of that was gone. During a quiet moment in the evening, Marcus overheard a conversation between two foreign businessmen that made his blood run cold. "The Duke's timing was perfect," one man said in heavily accented English. "Now that he has diplomatic immunity through the marriage, our shipping arrangements can proceed without concern. And the princess will provide excellent cover," the other replied. Who would suspect a beloved royal of facilitating arms shipments? Marcus pretended to adjust his uniform while straining to hear more, but the men moved away before revealing additional details. However, he had heard enough to confirm his worst suspicions. Princess Charlotte hadn't just been forced into marriage, she had been turned into an unwitting accomplice in illegal activities. The newlyweds left for their honeymoon the next morning, departing in a private jet bound for the Duke's estate in a remote region of Eastern Europe. Marcus watched from the tarmac as Princess Charlotte climbed the aircraft stairs. At the top, she turned and looked back at the palace one final time. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that her expression was one of profound loss, as if she was saying goodbye to everything she had ever been. They were gone for 6 weeks. When Princess Charlotte returned, the transformation that had begun months earlier was complete. She moved through the palace like a stranger, polite but distant to everyone, including longtime staff who had once been close to her. She no longer acknowledged Marcus by name, no longer showed any sign of recognition when they passed in the corridors. More disturbing was the way she had begun to dress and carry herself. Gone were the bright colors and modern styles she had once favored. Instead, she wore conservative clothing in muted tones, always with long sleeves that covered her arms completely. Marcus noticed that she never seemed to be without a handler of some kind, either her new personal secretary, a stern woman named Mrs. Blackwood, or one of several other staff members who had appeared after the marriage. Marcus also observed that Princess Charlotte's schedule had changed dramatically. Where once she had maintained active involvement in numerous charities and public causes, her calendar was now filled with social obligations that seemed designed primarily to showcase her marriage and her husband's business connections. She attended embassy dinners, corporate events, and private parties where the guest lists read like a who's who of international arms dealers and money launderers. The most troubling change was in Princess Charlotte's demeanor during these events. Marcus, working security at several functions, watched as she smiled and chatted with men he recognized from intelligence briefings as suspected war criminals. She posed for photographs with representatives of regime governments and signed autographs for weapons manufacturers. The woman who had once argued passionately about the ethics of royal duty was now being used as a propaganda tool for the exact kinds of people she would have despised. 3 months after the honeymoon, Marcus witnessed something that convinced him Princess Charlotte retained some awareness of her situation, despite her apparent compliance. During a state dinner at the palace, he was assigned to monitor the corridors outside the main dining hall when he heard the sound of someone being violently sick in a nearby bathroom. Concerned that a guest might need medical attention, Marcus approached the bathroom door just as Princess Charlotte emerged. Her face was pale and drawn, and she was trembling visibly. When she saw Marcus, she froze like a deer caught in headlights. "Your Highness, are you all right? Should I call for a doctor?" For just a moment, Princess Charlotte's mask slipped. Marcus saw pain and desperation in her eyes, the same fear he had witnessed during her treatment months earlier. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, to ask for help. to finally break the silence that had trapped her. But then Mrs. Blackwood appeared from nowhere, moving between Marcus and the princess with practiced efficiency. "Princess Charlotte is fine," Mrs. Blackwood said firmly. "She's simply tired from the evening's activities. I'll escort her to her chambers." "I was just checking to make sure she didn't need medical attention," Marcus explained. "Your concern is noted but unnecessary," Mrs. Blackwood replied coldly. "Please return to your assigned duties." As Mrs. Blackwood led Princess Charlotte away, Marcus caught one last glimpse of her face. She was looking back at him with an expression of such desperate sadness that it took all of his professional training to remain composed. In that look, he saw a plea for help that she couldn't voice, a cry for rescue from a situation that had become unbearable. That night, Marcus made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He wrote a detailed letter describing everything he had witnessed, from the initial argument between Princess Charlotte and Queen Isabella to the systematic psychological manipulation, the forced marriage, and the ongoing use of the princess for illegal activities. He sealed the letter and addressed it to James McKnight, an investigative journalist known for his fearless reporting on government corruption. Marcus had read McKnight's work for years and trusted him to handle such explosive information responsibly. The letter was posted from a mailbox miles from the palace, using gloves to avoid fingerprints and disguising his handwriting as much as possible. For 3 weeks, Marcus waited for some sign that his letter had been received and acted upon. He monitored the news constantly, expecting to see headlines about royal scandals or investigations into Princess Charlotte's situation. But nothing appeared. No articles, no investigations, no indication that McKnight had ever received the letter. On a rainy Thursday evening in June, Marcus learned why his letter had disappeared into the void. Thomas Brennan approached him after their shift with news that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Did you hear about James McKnight?" Thomas asked casually. "What about him?" "Car accident yesterday evening. Drunk driving, apparently. Hit a tree at high speed. Dead on impact." Marcus felt the world spin around him. "McKnight? But he didn't drink. I've read interviews where he talked about being sober for 15 years. Thomas shrugged. "People have relapses, I suppose. Tragic, really. He was working on some big story, according to the news reports. All his research materials were destroyed in the car fire. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too suspicious." Marcus realized with growing horror that his letter had not only been intercepted, it had likely cost James McKnight his life. The royal family's reach extended far beyond the palace walls, and their willingness to protect their secrets apparently included murder. That night, Marcus destroyed every note he had made about Princess Charlotte's situation. He burned his copies of duty rosters, threw away newspaper clippings, and deleted every photo from his phone that might be connected to what he had witnessed. The message was clear. Speaking out didn't just endanger himself, it put innocent people at risk. Over the following months, Marcus watched helplessly as Princess Charlotte disappeared further into her role as the Duke's compliant wife. Her public appearances became even more limited and carefully controlled. When she did appear in public, she seemed to be sedated, moving slowly and speaking in a flat, emotionless tone that suggested continued pharmaceutical intervention. The Duke, meanwhile, grew more prominent in international business circles. His marriage to Princess Charlotte had opened doors that had previously been closed to him, and he was using those opportunities to expand his questionable enterprises. Shipping contracts, mining rights, and arms deals that would have been impossible for a suspected criminal were now facilitated by his connection to the Valdonian royal family. Marcus began to understand the full scope of what Princess Charlotte had been sacrificed for. Her marriage wasn't just about legitimizing one man's criminal activities. It was about creating a royal shield that could protect an entire network of illegal operations. As long as Princess Charlotte smiled beside her husband at embassy functions and charity events, no one would look too closely at the cargo manifests or financial transfers that accompanied their social calendar. The most devastating realization came during a conversation Marcus overheard between Queen Isabella and Captain Morrison in December of 2019. He was standing guard outside the Queen's private office when their voices carried through the heavy door. "The Charlotte problem has been resolved more successfully than we hoped," Queen Isabella said. "She's completely manageable now, and the Duke has proven more useful than anticipated." "What about the long-term concerns?" Morrison asked. The medical team warned that the treatments could have permanent effects. "That's unfortunate but acceptable," the Queen replied without emotion. Charlotte was always too independent, too idealistic. She would have been a liability in her original state. This version serves the family's interests much better. Marcus felt physically sick at the casual way Queen Isabella discussed her daughter's destruction. There was no regret in her voice, no acknowledgement that they had taken a vibrant, compassionate young woman and turned her into a drugged automaton. To the Queen, Princess Charlotte wasn't a person. She was an asset to be managed for the family's benefit. As 2019 turned into 2020, Marcus found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He knew that Princess Charlotte was being held prisoner in plain sight, used as a propaganda tool while being slowly poisoned by whatever medications kept her compliant. He knew that her marriage was a sham designed to facilitate criminal activities. He knew that speaking out had already cost one man his life and would likely cost Marcus his own. But he also knew that remaining silent made him complicit in one of the most horrific crimes he could imagine: the complete destruction of a human being's mind and spirit for political gain. Marcus began to develop physical symptoms from the stress of his knowledge. He lost weight, couldn't sleep, and found himself jumping at unexpected sounds. His performance evaluations began to suffer, and he received several warnings about his apparent distraction while on duty. In March 22, as the world was consumed by the pandemic crisis, Marcus made his final attempt to help Princess Charlotte. During a brief moment when her handlers were distracted by an emergency drill, he approached her in a deserted corridor. "Princess Charlotte," he whispered urgently, "I know what they did to you. If you can understand me, if any part of you is still there, I want to help." Princess Charlotte turned to look at him with those empty eyes, and for just a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of recognition. Her lips moved silently, and Marcus leaned closer to hear. "Help me," she breathed so quietly that he almost missed it. "Please help me." But before Marcus could respond, Mrs. Blackwood appeared, her face dark with fury. "Step away from Princess Charlotte immediately," she commanded. "You have no business speaking to her." "I was just ensuring her safety," Marcus said, trying to maintain his professional composure. "Your services are no longer required in this area, Mrs." Blackwood replied. "Report to Captain Morrison immediately." As Marcus walked away, he heard Mrs. Blackwood speaking in urgent tones to Princess Charlotte, whose brief moment of awareness seemed to fade back into vacant compliance. The meeting with Captain Morrison was brief and final. Marcus was informed that his position was being eliminated due to budget constraints related to the pandemic. His service was commended, his final paycheck was generous, and his access to the palace was terminated effective immediately. "I trust you'll maintain appropriate discretion about your time here," Morrison said as Marcus turned in his uniform and identification. "The royal family values their privacy, especially during these challenging times." Marcus understood the real message. His attempt to reach Princess Charlotte had been observed and reported. He was being removed from the palace before he could cause further problems, but his silence was still required. As Marcus walked out of Blackstone Palace for the last time, he looked back at the windows of the East Wing where Princess Charlotte was being held prisoner. Somewhere behind those walls, a young woman who had once known his name and cared about right and wrong was disappearing a little more each day. And Marcus Wellington, former Royal Guard, current unemployed security officer, and lifetime keeper of dangerous secrets, walked away knowing that he had failed completely to save the one person who had needed his help the most. 5 years passed before Marcus Wellington saw Princess Charlotte again, and when he did, she was dead. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in March 2025. Marcus was working as a security supervisor at a shopping complex in downtown Valdris. A job that paid half of what his palace position had but allowed him to sleep at night without nightmares. He was reviewing staffing schedules when his phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. Princess Charlotte dies in tragic accident at Duke's estate. Marcus's hands began to shake as he read the details. According to the official report, Princess Charlotte had fallen from a balcony at her husband's castle while taking photographs of the sunrise. The fall had been witnessed by Duke Edmund himself, who had rushed to help but arrived too late to save her. She was 29 years old. The news coverage was immediate and overwhelming. Every television channel, every newspaper, every social media platform was flooded with tributes to the beloved princess who had been taken too soon. Photos of her wedding day played on repeat, along with footage from her charitable work before her marriage. The public mourning was genuine and heartbreaking, but Marcus saw something that the general public didn't. In the official photographs released by the palace, he noticed Princess Charlotte's appearance had continued to deteriorate over the past 5 years. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and vacant, even heavily made up for formal portraits. She looked like someone who had been slowly dying for a long time. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus knew he had to attend, not because he believed the official story, but because he needed to see for himself if there was any justice left in the world, any chance that the truth about Princess Charlotte's life and death would finally emerge. On the day of the funeral, Marcus stood among thousands of mourners lining the streets of Valdres. He watched the funeral procession pass by, noting the carefully orchestrated display of grief from the royal family. Queen Isabella dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, playing the role of bereaved mother with Oscar-worthy performance. Duke Edmund, now a widower, walked beside the coffin with the bearing of a man who had lost the love of his life. But Marcus noticed something else. Several former palace staff members were scattered throughout the crowd, people he recognized from his years of service. Their faces weren't displaying the public grief expected at such events. Instead, they looked relieved, as if a long nightmare had finally ended. After the ceremony, Marcus made a decision that had been building in his mind for 5 years. He was going to break his silence. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and began to write. Not a letter this time, but a complete account of everything he had witnessed during his years at the palace. He wrote about the argument between Princess Charlotte and Queen Isabella, about the systematic psychological manipulation, about the forced marriage, and the ongoing criminal activities it had facilitated. He wrote about Princess Charlotte's desperate plea for help in their final encounter, about the fear in her eyes during her treatment, about the way she had been systematically destroyed and then used as a shield for illegal activities. He wrote about James McKnight's convenient death and about the network of complicity that had made Princess Charlotte's destruction possible. Most importantly, he wrote about his own cowardice, his failure to act when it might have mattered, his choice to prioritize his own safety over the life of someone who had trusted him enough to acknowledge him by name every morning for years. When Marcus finished writing, he had 47 pages of testimony that would destroy the Valdonian royal family and expose an international criminal conspiracy. It was also a confession that would likely result in his own death, but Marcus had finally reached the point where living with his silence was more unbearable than the consequences of speaking out. The question was what to do with the document. James McKnight was dead, and Marcus suspected that other journalists who might be willing to publish such explosive material would face similar fates. He needed someone with enough protection and credibility to ensure the story would see light, even if he didn't survive to see it published. Marcus remembered reading about Elena Rodriguez, an investigative journalist who worked for an international news consortium and had built a reputation for exposing government corruption worldwide. She lived in neighboring Switzerland and had the backing of organizations that could provide protection for sources dealing with dangerous information. Using an encrypted email service and multiple layers of security that Marcus had researched obsessively, he sent his testimony to Rodriguez along with documentation he had secretly preserved from his palace years. Duty rosters showing his presence during key events, photographs that corroborated his timeline, and copies of medical supply orders that supported his claims about Princess Charlotte's treatment. Marcus included a note explaining that he expected to be killed for providing this information, but that he could no longer live with his silence. He asked only that the truth about Princess Charlotte's fate be revealed, so that her real story might serve as a warning about the abuse of power and the price of political convenience. 3 days after sending the email, Marcus received a response through the secure channel. Rodriguez had verified several elements of his story through independent sources and was preparing to publish a comprehensive investigation. She offered to arrange protection for Marcus and suggested he immediately leave Valdonia for his own safety. But it was already too late. On the morning Marcus received Rodriguez's email, he was approached by 2 men as he walked to work. They were polite, but firm, explaining that certain people wanted to speak with him about his recent communications. Marcus understood immediately that his security measures had been penetrated and his location compromised. The conversation took place in the back room of a cafe that had been cleared of other customers. The men didn't introduce themselves, but Marcus recognized the type from his palace years, intelligence operatives with the authority to make problems disappear permanently. Mr. Wellington, the older man said, we understand you've been struggling with some misconceptions about your time in royal service. It's unfortunate when stress and personal disappointment lead to fantasy and delusion. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus replied, though his shaking hands betrayed his fear. Of course you don't. That's part of the illness, isn't it? The inability to distinguish between reality and imagination. The man slid a folder across the table. These are medical records documenting your history of mental instability, depression, anxiety, paranoid delusions. Very sad, really. Marcus opened the folder and found detailed psychiatric evaluations that he had never undergone, prescriptions for medications he had never taken, and hospital admission records for treatments he had never received. The documents were perfect forgeries, backdated to create a timeline of mental illness that would explain away anything he might say about the royal family. We're prepared to ensure you receive the treatment you need, the second man added. A private facility where you can recover from these delusions in comfort. All expenses paid, of course, as a gesture of appreciation for your years of loyal service. The choice was clear. Accept commitment to a psychiatric facility where he would be drugged into compliance like Princess Charlotte had been, or refuse and face immediate consequences. Either way, his credibility would be destroyed and his testimony dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill man. What about the information I've already shared? Marcus asked. What information? You've shared fantasies with a journalist who will quickly realize she's been contacted by someone suffering from severe mental illness. No credible news organization would publish the delusions of a man with documented psychiatric problems. Marcus understood the complete hopelessness of his situation. Even if he submitted to psychiatric treatment, even if he remained silent for the rest of his life, the fabricated medical records would follow him forever. Any attempt to speak out would be dismissed as evidence of his mental instability. There is one other option, the older man said, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. A more permanent solution to your suffering. The implication was unmistakable. Marcus could choose forced psychiatric treatment, or he could choose suicide. The latter would be presented as the tragic end of a man overwhelmed by mental illness and guilt over imaginary failures. Either way, his testimony would be discredited, and the truth about Princess Charlotte would die with him. I need time to think, Marcus said. Of course. 24 hours should be sufficient to make an informed decision about your treatment options. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment, knowing it would be his last night of freedom. He had failed Princess Charlotte in life, and now he was failing her in death. The truth about her destruction would remain buried. Her memory would be preserved as a fairy tale of tragic loss, and the system that had murdered her would continue unchanged. But as Marcus prepared for what seemed like an inevitable end, his phone buzzed with a message from Elena Rodriguez. Her investigation had been fast-tracked and would be published simultaneously across multiple international platforms within hours. She had corroborated his account with testimony from other sources, including medical personnel who had been involved in Princess Charlotte's treatment. More importantly, Rodriguez had uncovered evidence that Princess Charlotte's death hadn't been an accident. Security footage from the Duke's estate, which had mysteriously been unavailable to initial investigators, clearly showed Princess Charlotte being pushed from the balcony during what appeared to be a violent argument with her husband. The Duke of Westmarch had murdered his wife when she had apparently threatened to expose their criminal activities. Intelligence services in 3 countries were preparing coordinated arrests of the entire conspiracy network. Even Queen Isabella was facing charges for her role in the systematic abuse of her own daughter. Marcus read the message 3 times before he could believe it. Princess Charlotte was getting her justice after all. The truth that had been buried for 7 years was finally emerging, and the people responsible for her destruction would face consequences. When the 2 men returned the next morning to collect Marcus for his psychiatric evaluation, they found his apartment empty. A note on the kitchen table explained that he had chosen exile over treatment, and that he was leaving Valdonia permanently. In reality, Marcus had been collected before dawn by Rodriguez's security team, and was already on a plane to a country that didn't have extradition agreements with Valdonia. The news broke 6 hours later. Headlines around the world proclaimed the biggest royal scandal in modern history. Princess Charlotte's real story, her resistance to criminal arrangements, her systematic psychological destruction, her forced marriage, and finally her murder, was front-page news in every major newspaper. Public reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted in Valdres as citizens demanded answers about how their beloved princess had been sacrificed for political convenience. The royal palace was surrounded by crowds calling for Queen Isabella's abdication and prosecution. Duke Edmund of Westmarch was arrested at his estate while attempting to destroy evidence. Computer records seized during the raid revealed the full scope of the criminal network he had operated using Princess Charlotte as diplomatic cover. Arms shipments, money laundering, human trafficking crimes that had been facilitated by royal immunity and conducted under the protection of a princess's reputation. The international investigation revealed connections to organized crime syndicates, terrorist organizations, and corrupt government officials across Europe and beyond. The marriage that had been arranged to legitimize one man's criminal activities had actually enabled crimes that had cost thousands of lives worldwide. Queen Isabella's abdication was announced 3 days after the story broke. She was arrested immediately afterward, along with Captain Morrison and dozens of other palace officials who had participated in the conspiracy. The entire structure that had enabled Princess Charlotte's destruction was being dismantled piece by piece. From his safe house in South America, Marcus watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. Justice was finally being served, but it had come too late for Princess Charlotte. She had died without knowing that her story would eventually be told, that her sacrifice would ultimately expose the corruption she had died trying to resist. The funeral Marcus had attended turned out to be the last lie told about Princess Charlotte's life. Her body was exhumed for a proper investigation, revealing evidence of long-term poisoning that supported Marcus's account of her systematic destruction. She was reburied with full honors as a victim of crime, rather than a casualty of tragic accident. A memorial fund established in Princess Charlotte's name became one of the largest charitable organizations in Europe, supporting victims of human trafficking and government abuse. Her real story, the story of a young woman who had chosen to resist evil even at the cost of her own life, inspired reforms in royal protocols and international oversight of diplomatic immunity. But for Marcus Wellington, now living under a new identity in a small coastal town where no one knew his history, the victory felt hollow. He had kept silent when his voice might have saved Princess Charlotte's life. He had chosen his own safety over her welfare, and no amount of posthumous justice could change that fundamental failure. Every morning, as Marcus walked along the beach near his new home, he thought about the young woman who had once greeted him by name in the corridors of Blackstone Palace. He remembered her warmth, her intelligence, her passionate commitment to doing what was right. And he carried the weight of knowing that if he had been braver, if he had acted sooner, Princess Charlotte might still be alive to see the justice that her death had finally made possible. The truth had emerged, the criminals had been punished, and Princess Charlotte's real story had become a legend that would inspire future generations to stand against corruption and abuse of power. But Marcus would spend the rest of his life knowing that courage delayed is often justice denied, and that the price of a guard's silence can be measured in the destruction of everything he was meant to protect. In the end, Marcus had learned that some memories are too heavy to carry alone, and some truths are too important to bury. Princess Charlotte's untold memory had finally been shared with the world, but it had taken her death to give Marcus the courage that might have saved her life. And that was a burden he would carry until his own final day.